All right. So between the political upheaval between the Qin and the Han dynasties, the Han's establishment of kind of this Chinese homeland, the mixing and the blending of Confucius and Lao Tzu and their philosophies, what effect does this have on China and its people and its society as a whole? Well, basically what ends up happening is a the like I said, the precedent for Chinese society is kind of set during the Han Dynasty. And what ends up happening is that these very strict Confucian ideas about class and about unequal relationships and filial piety creates a extremely static and conforming social structure. Um, your birth denotes where you are going to be in life. Social mobility is not a very big thing in Chinese society, especially during the classical era. If you are born into one of these classes, you essentially are going to stay in one of these classes until the day that you die. And there really isn't a whole lot of way to move up in this on this ladder. So, what are kind of the main social classes in China under the Han? Well, the top class is the government officials. These are the educated, the wealthy scholar gentry. These are the people who have graduated the royal academies. They have power within China. They have power over the different provinces, tax collectors, governors, essentially people who keep the Han Empire up and running. And they represent this new aristocracy that's created by the Han kind of out of nowhere, um, strictly based on their ability to implement Confucius ideas. Now, below them, but not that far below, is the landlord class. And generally, most of the government officials under the Han come out of this class originally. The landlords are the wealthiest class. That's going to be a theme for, I don't know, the next 1,500 years of this class. Until the Industrial Revolution, the main and in some cases only real source of wealth in the world is land. If you own land, you can rent it, you can grow food and crops and other things on it, you can build businesses on it, you can essentially, in order to have any kind of wealth, you must have land. Um, and the landowning class, again, until probably the 1750s, is going to be the only real wealthy class, I mean, mostly everywhere in the world. So this landlord class is no exception. They own or they rent the land to poorer peasants. They collect rent and taxes in the form of food, in the form of money, in the form of services. Now, this is the beginnings of a basically feudalistic system. Now, we don't necessarily deem it as feudalism. We'll talk about more explicit examples of feudalism when we get to medieval Europe and medieval Japan. But essentially, this is feudalism in practice. I give you land to live on, and in return, you provide me with a certain service or taxes paid in food or money or labor. Now, this class is the class that is the biggest threat to the power of the Han dynasty. They have money, they own land throughout the Han dynasty, depending upon who the emperor was and kind of which class he sided with. There's numerous back and forth kind of power struggles between the two. Some emperors favor the landlord class, lowering taxes on them, things like that, whereas other emperors saw the landlords as a threat, and they would sometimes seize the land of very wealthy landlords, redistribute it to the lower classes, basically, those landlords and sending them down the social ladder. Now, directly underneath the landlords are the peasants and the artisans. These are your lower and middle class people. Um, for the most part, they are beholden to the landlord class. Without having their own land, there is no opportunity for them to make money. There is no opportunity for them to produce a product or produce food to sustain themselves. So they essentially need the landlord class, and then the landlord class needs them back, but they need the landlords more than anything. Um, and finally, at the bottom, and this is a trend that you're going to see in quite a few East Asian nations, because again, China has a lot of cultural influence over East Asia. The lowest of the low is the merchants. And even though many of these merchants are very wealthy, they have the ability to purchase, essentially whatever they want. In some cases, they purchase land in order to move themselves up the social ladder. But Confucian philosophy and ideals looks down on the merchant class, because they see them as someone who is profiting not from their own efforts, but from the work of others. They're not making or producing anything. They are simply making money off of an artisan or a peasant who has worked very hard by buying and selling their products. So merchants were held in very low social standing, but they were also very tolerated because they were the ones that provided the luxuries that the bureaucratic and the landlord class wanted. They're the ones that provided, silver and spice from India. They're the ones that provided perfume and gold from the Middle East and Africa. So even though they are at the bottom of the social ladder, they do have kind of a preferred status because they have what people need. All right, let's wrap up China and move on to India. Now, politically, India is extremely different than most of the other regions during the classical era. And the main reason for that is the lack of political unity. As we talked about in the last unit, the Middle East and Africa, for the most part, are generally always under the rule of some large, powerful state. Okay, in the Middle East, it's generally the Persians with brief interruptions by the Greeks and Romans. In Africa, it's generally always the Egyptians with brief interruptions by Kush, Axum, and again, the Romans. India does not really have that. In the 1,200 or so years after the disappearance of those early Indus River Valley civilizations, India goes through a massive period of political instability. There is no one state that can unify all of India. And this is for a number of reasons. There's large scale migrations in and out of the continent constantly, people from Central Asia, from East Asia, which creates a lot of social and cultural strife. There's also invasions from nomadic people from Central Asia. And even among the native Indians themselves, they are generally divided into individual city states or small kingdoms, and none of these political units can ever really get to the point where they can unify all of India together. Now, all of that changes in 322 BCE. A group from Central Asia, right, commonly known as the Aryans, and we'll talk more about who the Aryans are and why they are such a big deal, um, are able to unite the majority of India, modern day Pakistan, modern day Afghanistan under one flag. The leader who is able to do this is a man by the name of Chandragupta Maurya, and this is the beginning of the Mauryan Empire. Now, unfortunately for the political unity of India, the Mauryan Empire does not really last. By 187 BC, the Mauryan Empire has kind of started to fall into decline because of political rivalry, lack of cultural unity, but mainly because of poor leadership. So, the greatest of those Mauryan emperors is a man by the name of Ashaka, who is the great grandson of Chandragupta. And Ashaka, basically is considered the high point of not only the Mauryan Empire, but of kind of all of the Indian empires of history. Ashaka is a general and he is a warrior and he comes from the warrior class in India. But as he gets older, he begins to kind of recoil from the amount of bloodshed that it takes to maintain such a large empire. And he begins to look for more tolerant and peaceful ways to rule. And he begins to introduce these political reforms all over his empire. Religious freedom expands. Ashaka himself begins to promote Buddhism and their kind of more peaceful message. He builds monuments and temples all over India to celebrate Buddhism and to celebrate their ideas of kind of pacifism and toleration. Now, after the fall of the Mauryans, you again have another long period of political instability and infighting all over India. And the Indian people are not going to be united again until around 320 CE, which, I mean, if you're counting on your fingers here, is almost 450 years. This time, they're going to be united under a group known as the Guptas. The Guptas are able to kind of piece back together the majority of what was the Mauryan Empire, but they are very, very, very different than the Mauryans. They are less centralized, meaning that there's less government control. Local leaders are given more authority. They're also very aggressively Hindu. They don't do away with religious tolerance, but they aggressively promote Hinduism over Buddhism, which helps to contribute to the decline in, Buddhism's popularity throughout India. One of the very positive things about the Guptas, though, is that they are, very much patrons of the arts. They use their power and their wealth to promote education. They sponsor, poets and artists, and this kind of becomes a cultural golden age in India. Now, unfortunately, again, just like in the past, the Gupta Empire eventually falls into decline and begins to fall apart, mainly because they never were really that unified to start with. Those local leaders who they gave a lot of autonomy to begin to build up their own power and eventually break away from the empire. And basically, you go back to the system of warring, kingdoms and city states. And once the Gupta Empire fragments and falls apart, you're basically not going to see another unifying empire in India until the Mughals, and that's not going to happen until well into the 1400s. So, another essentially 1,000 years of political instability for India.